Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to have everybody here today on this third International SEL Day for us to celebrate each other and find common ground and pursue the common good. We're going to have this conversation about what we really want for students. And we're going to really focus on finding common ground around different aspects of social and emotional learning. But before we get there, I want to take a moment to reflect on what Social and Emotional Learning Day is. 2022, the SEL Day is focused on finding common ground and pursuing the common good. Now, there are folks across the country who've dedicated their lives to ensuring that social and emotional skills are part and parcel of what it means to be educated in the United States and beyond. And today, I have a very special gift, a letter from the President of the United States and the First Lady, who talked about recognizing SEL Day for all of you. So I'm going to take a moment, I'm going to read from this letter so that you guys recognize the power of social and emotional learning in today's day and age. From the White House, the First Lady and I are proud to recognize International Social and Emotional Learning Day. One of the things that we've gained during this pandemic is a renewed understanding of how important it is to see each other, hear each other, take care of each other, especially in this time of challenge and need. And that's what International SEL Day is all about. And so, from the President of the United States and the First Lady on this International Social and Emotional Learning Day, we reaffirm the need to give schools, families, and communities the resources required to enhance social and emotional learning. And by doing so, we can empower our students to succeed in the classroom and beyond. Next slide. So we know last year we had an amazing impact on Social and Emotional Learning Day. And this year, we can do even more. We are already trending on Twitter, number 5 in the most important topics that are being spoken on Twitter today. And in order to get us to number 1, what I need you guys to do out here in this audience is make sure you're listening to all of our esteemed panelists. And if they say something that really moves you, they say something that gets you thinking about the importance of social and emotional learning, I need you to go on social media, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, using the hashtag SELDay, and I need you to quote the panelists, quote the things that they're saying so we can elevate the importance of Social and Emotional Learning Day when we're finding common ground and pursuing the common good. Next slide. Now, before we get in here, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all the sponsors that helped us get here today. On behalf of the Urban Assembly and SEL Day, as well as CASEL, I want to thank Aperture Education, the Educational Development Center, Harmony, Aspire, Lions Quest, Second Step, Up to US Sports, Move This World, and Panorama for bringing Social and Emotional Learning Day to you. Now, before we get started, I want to remind us that this is our opportunity. While the President of the United States is watching Social and Emotional Learning Day, the most important folks watching it are you. The counselors, the teachers, the community members, the parents who can uplift social and emotional learning throughout your community. So go out there, tweet, Facebook, take a picture, and make sure you hashtag it SELDay. Next slide, please. Now, we've talked a lot about SEL Day, which is the framing for today. Let me introduce you to our panelists. The first panelist is John Bridgeland, otherwise known as Bridge. He is the founder and CEO of Civic, a man after my own heart who cares about what it means to be in community as Americans. Welcome, Bridge.
Thanks, David.
Next, we have the esteemed, often imitated, but never quite replicated, Karen Pittman, partner, KP Catalyst, and co-founder and former CEO for the Forum of Youth Investment, one of the premier folks who are focusing on what does it mean to have all adults support the social emotional development of young people. Karen, welcome.
Thank you.
There you are on video. We're so happy to have you here today, given all the things that you're doing in your life. We appreciate you spending time with us on SEL Day. Last, but certainly not least, we have the President and CEO of CASEL, Dr. Aaliyah A. Samuel. Welcome, Dr. Samuel, for this conversation today.
Thank you, David.
Well, speaking of Dr. Samuel, I'm actually going to come off camera now. I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're going to help us to unpack the jargon, talk about social and emotional learning, celebrate SEL Day. Dr. Samuel, the stage is yours. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, David. And what an honor it is to be a part of this my very first International SEL Day. I've just enjoyed watching all of the different cities and countries join the chat. And I would be remiss without doing a couple of special shout outs. I was a teacher and assistant principal in Florida. So huge shout out to those joining us from Florida. I was a principal in Arizona. Love seeing all of the cities in Arizona. I am also from Panama. I saw somebody from Panama City, Panama. So shout out to you, hola, ¿cómo estás? And all the other countries that are also on this call. It's just truly an honor to see so many like-minded individuals coming together around a topic that we know is so critical now more than ever. And today's conversation, we know, is about exploring the points of common ground that we have, whether you are in Michigan, whether you are in New York, whether you are in Indiana or India. We know that this pandemic, we know that social emotional learning is such a critical need for our students and our educators. And what we'd like to do is spend some time talking about how we can really achieve some of these shared goals, how we can foster a deeper level of understanding of how to support our students' social, emotional, and academic learning. We know that there's a lot of education terms, including social emotional learning, and there are important reasons why those terms were chosen and why they resonate and how they resonate with educators. And there's also multiple audiences that are talking about SEL and using the terms differently. And because of those differences, there's some confusion. And we know that there has really been a spotlight on social emotional learning and SEL. And so I'm looking forward to spending some time and talking about how we can unpack the terms in a way that creates connections with families and communities around social emotional development, and really how we can use these connections across the different audiences to bring employers together, parents together, teachers together, because we know that the need is ever present and greater than ever. And so what I would love to do is open up the conversation to our esteemed guests, Bridge and Karen, to talk about these commonalities so that people aren't spending time around the misconception, but really focusing on these common areas. And so I'd like to open it up. Bridge, Karen, across your sectors, where are the commonalities around social emotional learning? And I know we come to this conversation from different perspectives. And so I'll just open it up. For what are you hearing?
Thanks, Aaliyah. Or Karen, go ahead. No, please.
Thanks. I think the commonalities are clear when we get from the labels down to the real words of what we're talking about. So I think anytime we're having conversations, whether it's with employers, it's with folks in the youth development space, it's with school folks, it's with people in prevention and other treatment areas. As soon as we begin to talk about the skills and competencies we want our young people to have, people hear and they nod. When we ask parents, as Learning Heroes does constantly, what do you want for your children? What are those skills and competencies that they need to have to succeed? The lists are long and they're varied and they're consistent in the fact that they blend together social, emotional, cognitive, and academic. And I guess I would just want to introduce the cognitive word into social and emotional, because we don't want to assume that everything that has to do with executive function, higher order thinking is just for academics. That's what we need to be able to work in the world, not just work well in school. So the idea that when we talk specifics about what we want young people to have, there's a lot of commonality. But when, as you said at the beginning, Aaliyah, when we get to the point of talking, using the language that we used to get this shorthanded so it could get into a system like the education system, which was critically important, by the time that acronym or that sort of very high level summary term gets out into the community, it has a lot of room for misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just, first of all, it's so wonderful to be with Karen. We work together on the National Seed Commission, and Aaliyah, it's so wonderful to have you at the helm of CASEL. And I'm going to try to channel my dear old friend, Roger Weissberg, who I know is here with us today. I also think one thing that's so powerful, what we have in common, is the larger context in which SEL is coming today, which is tremendous division and dysfunction in our politics in our country, coming out of a completely isolating pandemic with huge impacts on kids that just cry out for social and emotional cultivation. Even the invasion in the Ukraine is a failure of empathy and understanding and listening and knowing one another. So I think highlighting the need for SEL in the context of the real world problems we face is a really important context for this work. The other thing I'd say is that, when we've surveyed, the good news, as Karen said, is we've done these nationally representative surveys with CASEL of parents, students, teachers, administrators, and they're all completely supportive of the cultivation of social emotional development in their children's lives. And in fact, when you ask parents what they want most for their kids, the leading answer is actually not success in school or a good job or either other markers of real world achievement. It's happiness. They intuitively want their children to be whole and happy. I was talking with my daughter the other day about why we thought The Wizard of Oz resonated so much. And we came to this conclusion. It was really an education in SEL. The dog is named Toto, which is wholeness. Dorothy can't grow up from the world of the child to the world of the adult without having the brain of the scarecrow, the heart and compassion of the Tin Man, and the fortitude and the courage of the lion. And it's actually in the trilogy that Frank Baum wrote, in the stories that follow, Oz, not Kansas, is where her dreams are, where her happiness is. And it's the integration of those three ideas. And the other thing that I think is important is, remember Patricia Kuhl from the University of Washington, Karen, came into that first session of our commission. And she said, we actually have a social gate to learning. You actually can't learn the academic material unless it's in a social context. So I think we have to remind parents and teachers who know it intuitively and policymakers that if you want better academic achievement, you're gonna need to focus on the cultivation of the whole child.
As a parent, I have two sons in elementary school. They started when the pandemic started. My youngest was in kindergarten. My oldest was in third grade. And there was a really profound moment when I realized both the impact socially and emotionally, particularly on my oldest son, my third grader. And this is with both parents working from home, stable household, all the supports in place. One day he just would not get on remote learning. And he was just at the window, staring out the window. And his nickname is Buddy. And I was like, Buddy, you got to sit down. You got to get back online. And he said, Mom, this must be what prison feels like. And my heart broke. And the impact of not being able to be with his friends, the impact of not being able to see and be with his teacher and be in that community was really impacting him. And that day we all shut down work, we shut down computers, and what he needed was really just time with his family, time to feel loved. And it's real, and we don't know the lasting impacts. And so it's just very real. And we still don't know. And, I'm hearing a lot of pieces of the academic skills, the cognitive skills, the life skills, the happiness, the dreams. And, the social emotional piece is really woven into so many different components of life. And, I think about, as educators, we're using the term SEL. We hear the workforce talking about it as soft skills, team building skills. And, as we hear these different groups talking about the importance of these skills, really trying to hone in on how do we continue to amplify the need for these skills. And so do you have a recommendation, Bridge or Karen, as how do we continue to amplify the need for these skills? Or would you have recommendations for, as we're all in these different areas, to continue to use unifying language? Do you have some recommendations?
I just say it's an interesting, Tim Shriver and I, who work to get this National Seed Commission going, we saw in some of the press that there were some of the conservative groups were sort of taking SEL on pretty strongly. And so we ended up doing these dinners over at the American Enterprise Institute. And we discovered that when we first started talking, a lot of these folks had no idea what we were talking about when we said SEL, or social and emotional learning. And in fact, they had some pretty troubling concepts of what that meant. And so when we got, as Karen said, you know, you get away from the jargon or the shorthand that can cause confusion, and you talk about, you know, knowing yourself, which is as old as Socrates, you know, setting clear goals and achieving them, listening to other people's perspectives and having empathy, collaborating across different, solving problems. Everybody in the room said, oh, we're for that. And then we started talking about, you know, what Gene Wilholt loves to call how do we create the enabling conditions in school environments and out of school time and families, communities, and connect those things up in ways. Last thing I'd say is, you know, when Jefferson penned, and he was an imperfect man, but when he penned this mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness, and Martin Luther King reflects this in his letter in a Birmingham jail when he quotes Martin Buber, he wasn't just talking about an individual right. And we saw this as a problem in the pandemic. Everybody was talking about rights. More people needed to talk about responsibility. Happiness is a cooperative enterprise that we help one another achieve. I can't be happy unless I worry about the health and happiness of Karen and Aaliyah and the person who's in poverty or homeless. And that requires a certain amount of social and emotional connectedness. So I love the words discipline, grit, persistence, collaborative problem solving. And it happens to be exactly what the country and the world needs more of. Karen?
Yeah, I would jump in to say one easy place to start to look for ways to tackle the problem is grab a box of Girl Scout cookies. The ubiquitous things that we know are sold this time of year. And I happen to be sort of sitting eating a box of Girl Scout cookies, or at least trying not to eat the whole box, when Stephanie Krause's article came out in EdSurge, and I read that. And I thought, you know, the challenge is, again, what happens when we put this term out, not just the term SEL, but the importance of putting the term out from the system that we call school, because school is about teaching. And so when school says, when educators say, we are going to do SEL, I don't know that it's heard differently from, we're going to teach your kids algebra, we're going to teach them, etc. When we say that, on the one hand, parents are encouraged by that. On the other hand, it's put in the same mix of, there's a curriculum, there's a certain set of things that have to happen. My kid is going to get graded on it. There's an anxiety that comes along with the term social emotional learning as it's associated with schools. On the other hand, if you look at the box of Girl Scout cookies, and I happen to have Thin Mints, the amount of information, that's my favorite, the amount of information on that box that I think is incredible, that just says what we're talking about. So the Girl Scout program, this is reading from the box, is the largest girl-led entrepreneurial program in the world. Through it, girls learned 5 essential skills: goal setting, decision, and the little things underneath I won't read, decision making, money management, people skills, business ethics. And then it goes on to just talk about how girls build courage, confidence, and character. The number of words on this box is amazing. And the fact that girls are not just selling the cookies, they're ready to tell you how they are using the experience of selling the cookies to build these skills. So there's something about learning when it happens in this volunteer, interest-driven space that we call community programs, where kids get to pick what they want to do. They leave if they don't like it. Their parents are more involved. It's not graded. It's not measured. That we're not seeing flag. I'm not seeing a call out against Girl Scouts, but they have been much more explicit on the box of cookies about what their intention is in helping young people build these skills. But the fact that they're building them through work that's visible, that's community driven, and that parents can see and appreciate, is a difference that I think we have to think about when we're talking. It's not just about the acronym, it's also about the connection of the acronym to this big box that we call school, where when my kid put my kid in school, I'm relinquishing some control over what happens.
Karen, you bring up a really great point about communities, schools, parents, and social emotional learning does not just happen in schools. I think about it, my principalship, I was at a neighborhood school, and a true neighborhood school, and just the importance of that parent, community, school partnership. Can you talk a little bit more about the types of learning do we want to see across parents or homes, schools, and communities, and that out of school time?
Yeah. One thing that's useful before we think about where the skills are built is to think about what kind of learning we're talking about. And there really are three kinds, and I like to alliterate. So we all understand formal learning. Classroom, you go in, there's a curriculum, a certain amount of information has to be mastered in a certain amount of time, it's graded, etc. That's formal learning. That happens in school, but it also happens in colleges, it happens in employment training centers, it happens lots of places. Then there's informal, where we can call it flexible learning, if we want to alliterate. Flexible learning is more interest-driven. It doesn't have the same sort of time and assessment constraints on it. And it's just different in that it is voluntary, that not only am I doing it because I'm interested, if I don't like it, usually I can leave. So there's something about that perspective, but it's group. And then there's sort of individual or free choice learning is the third F, if we want to alliterate. And that's the learning that I do online, the learning that I do in the library, the learning that I do just on my own. Now, those are all learning settings. We all use all of them all the time. We all need them. Some of us do better in some than others. They're good for different purposes. The challenge that we have is when we think of school, we just think of formal learning. Then we think of out of school, we think, oh, that's the informal or the flexible learning. And then we think of home, and that's kind of where you're on your own, you're doing whatever you want. Those three settings are all important. Those three settings are all places where all three kinds of learning can happen. So one of the things that happens when we overemphasize what the role is of each, they all lead with one or the other. When we overemphasize formal learning is what happens in school, we focus on the classroom and we don't recognize the other 50% of the adults in the building who are not the classroom teachers. The other almost 50% of the time, if you think about when I get on the bus to how to get off the bus, I put in recess and lunch and everything else, that I'm not in a formal academic class, but I'm with adults. I'm with kids. I'm in some kind of setting in which some learning is happening, some experiencing is happening, whether that is being intentional, whether it's being positive, whether it's being reinforced, that's up to us as adults. So when we think about the different settings where learning is happening, it's really important for us to recognize that school, family, and community organizations lead with different forms of learning, but they're all places where everything can happen. And the most important thing is parents recognize this. So a year or so ago, when Learning Heroes did a survey of parents, teachers, and youth workers and asked, where do you find these, they asked the parents, where do you find these different skills and competencies in school, out of school, and family? They were very clear that school is where we expect you to get reading and math and problem solving and critical thinking. That's what we expect to happen there, and time management. And these community programs are where we want our kids to learn teamwork and perseverance and things like that. And then at home, we want them to really learn kindness and respect. Not that those are things that don't happen in other places, but parents naturally saw an emphasis that you can match the kind of social, emotional, and cognitive skill building with the setting. And that's what we need to be able to get to. Not think of these as big three separate pillars, home, school, community, but think of these as a continuous set of opportunities for experiencing where we have to lead with relationships, manage the experience, optimize the setting, because it always starts with relationships and experiences. Then we optimize the setting for what it was meant for. So that's the way I would think about if we can really unbundle this from, it's not just that schools can't do it alone. Schools often are not the primary place when we think about it, where social, emotional, and cognitive development is happening, if that has to be built on relationships, and it has to be built on trust, and it has to be driven by interest.
I love that. You did it again, Karen, with the alliteration. You kept doing that at the National Seed Commission. And by the way, my favorite are do-si-dos, not Thin Mints, and we'll have to hear from Aaliyah. But it's so interesting you talk about the integration of family, school, community, and some of our perceptions about, who does what to whom and for what purpose. And my experience in high school, as I think back on it, was I learned as much about SEL from sports teams, student government, service learning. We just did this big project with Allstate around the relationship between SEL and service learning. I'll give you two quick examples. Through my church, we went and did Bible study in the prison. And for a 17-year-old kid like me, going into the prison in inner city Cincinnati and seeing all this potential basically locked up and how extraordinary these individuals were, it changed my whole perspective of a population that is stigmatized. Changed my life. Second example, Ethel Kennedy, Bob Nixon, and I co-chair something called the Earth Conservation Corps, which engages young people in a year of national service. And I had the audacity during a service project to ask the Corps members, what are your politics and faiths and backgrounds? Well, we had a lot of Democrats, some independents, and some Republicans. We had a Christian and a Muslim. We had people of different income, backgrounds. And here they were crossing difference and solving, helping to clean up the Anacostia River. And they're actually this little band that brought back the bald eagle to the nation's capital, which hadn't been there since 1947. And in the process of serving and learning from one another, they got a different perspective about the other and this whole notion of othering and stigmatizing and stereotyping and how dangerous that is in our culture. That was an SEL exercise. And just so eye-opening for the kids and for the adults.
Bridge, to that point, on just really recognizing othering and different perspectives, I think about future readiness and the workforce. And I think about Google. Early on, Google was one of the employers who realized that STEM skills, the science skills weren't enough. And the focus on just those core academic skills was not enough. That fundamentally, the emotional skills, the emotional intelligence was far more important than just those hardcore skills. And that things like empathy, problem solving, collaboration, understanding others' perspectives were really the qualities that they wanted in all their employees, but really their new leaders as well. And how to cultivate that emotional intelligence in their new leadership became a really paramount part of their hiring process. And so as we think about future readiness and we think about just the demand and the future of the workforce, I would love to hear your perspective and maybe even some of the connections that the Seed Commission found on the future of work and what does it mean for social emotional skills. And Karen, I see you nodding your head too.
Thanks, Aaliyah. It's interesting. One of my favorite people in the education workforce world is a guy named Anthony Carnevale. And he said once at a meeting, he said, I think the purpose of education is to help young people live well in and advance their times. And as we dug deep into that, I hope today, in addition to talking about the relationship between SEL and the demands of the workforce, we also can touch upon, the importance of participating and contributing to our democracy. When the Atlantic wrote a story on the cover by Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center saying, is our democracy dying? because we didn't have the ways and means through civil society, faith, with the decline of faith-based civic organizations and others, we actually weren't practicing the SEL and other skills that cultivate and engage democracy. And also, I think it's incumbent upon us, SEL is as old as the Greeks, all the way through James Comer, and when it became in sort of the lexicon of how it was talked about and envisioned. But I think it's important that we also look at what's the role of SEL in advancing human progress and evolution and our development as human beings. Natalie Walrond, I think it is, who directs the federally funded National Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety, described SEL as undergirding personal purpose. How wonderful. Healthy relationships, a sense of place in community and obligation to it, success in school and the workplace, and engaged citizenship. So I would, we have this match between huge demand from students, parents, and others who recognize the criticality of these skills. And then when I was talking with Josh Bolton, who is my old boss, who runs the Business Roundtable, I said, Josh, it seems like SEL is pretty central to your work. And he said, oh my God, Bridge, we're writing a whole report on it because our businesses aren't getting the employees who are sufficiently equipped with working in teams, collaborating, problem solving, discipline, grit, setting goals, all the things we talk about, persistence, self-management, self-control. And so, this wonderful marriage occurred around the National Seed Commission that Karen was such a force in. And so I'd invite Karen and you, Aaliyah, to reflect on what's the relationship between SEL and future readiness, not just jobs, but also more broadly in terms of the vibrancy of our democracy and the connection across our world. Karen?
Well, I mean, I think the connection is huge. I hope the connection is obvious. And I guess I'm concerned that somehow in trying to get people to understand SEL, we have narrowed it to a point that we even have to make the argument. I mean, why you not want not only an educated, but an engaged and excited citizenship? That's the bedrock of what makes our country our country. And so when we ask questions about, so how do we make this happen? It isn't just that we have to teach. When we say social emotional learning, and you say it in the school context, I still come back to, you hear teaching and learning. We need social emotional listening. We need social and emotional leadership. We need social and emotional leverage. We need to be able to leverage these things wherever we have them. We need to think of as many L's. I'm running out of L's, but I'll work on it to alliterate. But I think it's really, really important that we understand that for this to happen, for us to not just talk about how we integrate social, emotional, and academic development, we really have to think about how we fully engage young people in deep problem solving. I don't just mean mental problem solving, in meaningful problem solving. Social emotional engagement doesn't really happen. Cognitive engagement doesn't really happen until we're handed meaty problems that are difficult but not impossible for us to solve. We've got to be given something that's relevant, that's rigorous, that's exciting, that we can dig into. We can fail, but we're going to move forward. And that's what we want. We want young people who are so used to failing forward, so confident that they can fix it, they can do it, that by the time they come out of high school, they have all those skills and they have the motivation. The thing I think is all been missing when we have these conversations is, especially as we're looking at behavior, whether it's employers looking at the behavior of entry-level workforce, or it's schools or out-of-school folks looking at the behavior of the young people in their programs and classrooms. Behavior is a combination of your capacity, your motivation, and your opportunity. That's an official model. It's called the COMB model. It's just in psychology. Capacity, motivation, and opportunity. Your capacity, we're often talking about are these skills, but if we overemphasize we have to teach these kids these skills, and we don't actually ask whether they're motivated to use them, which starts by feeling that I'm safe. You talked about belonging and othering. I have to start by feeling that I'm in a safe place, that I belong. Or it could be a challenge. It could be risky for me to even show you what skills I have. Then opportunity is interest. Is what you're asking me to do relevant? Is it feasible? Am I interested in it? So we really can't see the behavior that we want in young people if we're not sure that they not only have the capacity, but they have the motivation, they have the opportunity. And when we're talking about looking at just behavior, we can often misinterpret what we think of as a lack of skills and come back and want to teach more skills. We have to help you have these skills. And in fact, that wasn't the problem. The problem was I wasn't comfortable using them. You didn't name them for me, so I didn't know they were important. I call them something different. You call them something else. I didn't know that's what you wanted me to be leading with. Or I just wasn't, the interest wasn't there. The opportunity wasn't right for me to use it. So I think as we're looking toward the future, we really do have to think about, and we're really thinking about equity, we have to think about how we look at all of this and make sure that when we don't see the skills that we want, even in the middle of COVID and everything we're talking about, when we don't see the skills that we want, is it that the skills are not there or that we haven't created the opportunity for them to surface?
That's great, Karen. And I'd say I often think of if we could bring more SEL to the US Congress, and what a spirit of listening to one another and empathizing and really understanding context and background, and then collaborate to solve problems together. That's what the American people want. Aaliyah, I think we're going to move to Q&A, but please feel free to comment and then we'll move.
I think two things I want to add. One, as we think about young people, we think about the future of work, there are so many pathways for young people now. And SEL is truly, I think about those young adults that are going, whether it's the traditional pathway, the non-traditional pathway, and even those that are going the entrepreneurial route, like YouTube and, pathways that didn't exist when I was exploring college, and how important those skills are even for those young people who are truly exploring pathways that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so fundamentally, we have to look at the future of work differently. And I want to go back to the power of relationships, because we have this population that, because of the pandemic, because of virtual school, became disengaged. And we have a population of kids who may not have gone back to high school, may not have gone back to whatever post-secondary program they were in, certificate they were in. And we have to think about the power of those relationships to bring these students back, to bring these young people back. And that is really what will ultimately be what I think will put them on the trajectory to whatever they wanted to do. And we just can't underscore enough the importance and power of the relationships, whether it was a school relationship, a community relationship, parental relationship, but the power of those relationships. And, that is so much of the foundation of SEL. And so I just wanted to really double click on that, particularly for those youth that have found themselves disconnected because of those transition years. I really worry about them the most for a variety of reasons. And so I know it's time to transition to Q&A. And so I believe David Adams is popping back on. There he is. And here we go.
Wow, what a remarkable conversation. And if you guys wouldn't mind, I just want to recap some of the key things that I heard and resonated with. The first thing that really hit me is this notion of happiness is not an individual exercise, but a cooperative exercise that helps people to achieve. We had Karen Pittman ever alliterating the Girl Scout cookies, the different kinds of learning, right? And the different ways that experience teaches us how to be together, as well as just direct instruction. And the back of a Girl Scout box was something that you used to really illustrate that point. Then we had Aaliyah really focusing on this idea of what kind of language do we use to describe social and emotional skill development? What are the different paradigms, and how do we communicate those things in ways that parents resonate with? And then last, going back to Bridge, this notion of being in community, right? This reflection of democracy not being this huge system of governance in which we elect presidents, but really being a small community problem-solving system in which we come together to solve the problems of how to live in relationship and community with each other. And all these things are grounded in the common good and social and emotional skill development. So thank you so much for that fascinating conversation. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go over to the question and answer. And if you guys have not put a question in there, this is your time. Get into that question and answer, and I will make sure that we get to at least some of these for our esteemed panelists today. So the first question I am going to bring up comes from, this is a tough name for me, Irimina. I apologize if I didn't get that correct. Felix Oturimio. So that I gave my best shot on that. And the question is talking about, can SEL be qualified as part of the soft skills needed for future workforce? Bridge, I'm going to send this over to you. Help us understand, is SEL soft skills when you're talking to the folks at the Business Roundtable? Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah, they use that term soft skills. We actually say essential skills, because some people think soft is not serious. And I think that's unhelpful. And so the Business Roundtable is all in, so is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and National Association of Manufacturers. We've worked with all of them through our COVID collaborative. And I will say the movement that CASEL and the Seed Commission and many on this webinar today have been behind is growing. Teachers told us that while 95% supported SEL, they didn't call them soft skills, by the way, only 44% said that it was systemic in their school system, and that's been growing over time. The second thing I'd say, a wonderful comment in the chat, we don't, of course, just need a SEL in the Congress. We need it for all Americans. But the point I was trying to make was that adults model behavior. And when you have leaders, national leaders, whether it's a president or policymakers or governors or whomever, who aren't modeling the kinds of skills that we're trying to cultivate in the next generation of young people, that's a real headwind against the force of SEL. And that's why I think it's so important for the adults, not just teachers, but our leaders at all levels need to model these skills.
Well, it's a great point, Bridge. And just to follow up on what you're saying, in fact, our Congress members are adults, right? So when we say we all need SEL skills, it really means all of us, right? It just, as you said, some folks have a higher level of responsibility to model these skills so that young people see what effective problem solving looks like. And I'm actually going to use that.
David,
oh yeah.
Can I just add to? I was watching the chat. There are states like Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia that have what they call profile of a graduate, and those have both workforce and education standard skills that outline some SEL and workforce skills to the question in the chat that are very concrete and outline what those skills are. There was a question in the chat of what those concretely what those skills are. And so, yes, there are core examples. And then Justina put in the chat as well what those concrete strategies are, so that you can have examples of what those essential workforce skills are as well. So we can get those examples out.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. And I'm actually going to take this opportunity to send something over to you, Karen. This is coming from Laura McKinley. And she said that the panel discussed the importance of social emotional instruction happening at home and in communities. Do you, Karen, believe that adults are equipped to support our youth in this way? And how might we engage and educate our adults in SEL? Karen Pittman, take it away.
The short answer is absolutely yes, I do. I believe that everybody can get better at it. I think the more we are both transparent and intentional about it, and the more we see this as not something that is a curriculum that you have to have an advanced degree in order to be able to sort of teach young people, but the more it is that you have to be able to recognize the words that we're talking about, empathy, life skills, empathy, the things that we want young people to be able to do. This is really about reinforcement. It's about naming and reinforcing and giving young people a chance to practice and giving them a chance to be challenged to develop these skills. That's what we need. Can all adults do this? Absolutely. Do we have other adults in the community who are trained to do this? Absolutely. The folks in the youth field, in the youth development field, whether they're in Girl Scouts, like the Girl Scout cookies, Boys and Girls Clubs, tons of national organizations that are the brand names, and lots of local organizations. Their volunteers and their staff are trained professionals who actually are leading in this because they don't have the requirement that they have to teach academics. That doesn't mean that they're not teaching anything. It just means that they're not bound by a curriculum, a slate of curriculum that have to be delivered. That really, and some of the folks are saying in the questions, how do we build this into art or science or math because it's so difficult to fit this into the school day? Well, if you start with the idea that learning is social and emotional, if you start with the idea that if we work with young people in something that they're interested in, and we help them be challenged, not just toward that interest, but also challenged to bring all those social and emotional competencies that they have and use them and practice them and get rewarded for them, that's really, those experiences are what's going to happen. That's what the best is. So it's not that these youth workers and youth development professionals in community are somehow more advocates of social emotional learning. It really is that they, without the constraint of academics on it, not because you can't do them together, but because of the way in school we have put academics into a curriculum formula that doesn't, as people are saying, doesn't seem to allow room you to have the space to recognize social emotional. So my short answer is yes, families and communities can do it. Yes, there are adults in other systems that are doing this and have been trained to do it. And yes, we can all do this much better, but it does take time. It really does take time. And that's the missing piece in this.
Thank you so much, Karen. Aaliyah, I'm actually going to turn this over to you. Karen actually talked about a lot of practice and a lot of need to really reinforce social emotional skills. This question comes from Ria Juarez, and she asks, can we incorporate SEL skills into subjects we already have? Karen talked a little bit about this. Karen talked about the importance of using the entire ecosystem of adults to support young people in social emotional development. But what about the work that's already happening? What can this look like in math and science and literature? Aaliyah.
Yes, and you know, I think so. Yes, it can absolutely be integrated, and there are some great examples. I was actually just reading a New York Times article probably about 2 weeks ago that I posted on my LinkedIn page because it was such a good example of how social emotional learning can be integrated into science and how it's become talked about. It's been bifurcated that you have to do social emotional learning and then you have to do science or math, when really fundamentally it should be integrated in everything that you do. It shouldn't be a box that's checked that it's, you know, we're going to do 30 minutes of SEL every Wednesday. It should really be just part of what's integrated in the fabric of how we do business. And so there are some really great examples of how SEL can be integrated into the curriculum. You know, I think this is this question is a really good indicator of how we've talked about SEL as something that's different. And really, as we talk about what SEL programs are or what SEL is, it really should just be part of what good instruction is. And you know, when we talk about veteran teachers, when you see SEL just in work in a classroom, it's so organic, it's so natural that it's hard to pull it apart and really identify it. It's creating that place and space. And so we can have some of our team put in some examples in the chat. And there are some really good examples of how to do it well. And I will say that I think as we talk about teacher prep programs, I think this is another place where as we talk about the partnership and preparing the next generation of teachers, that we could do some work on of how to help teachers understand how to teach SEL so that it doesn't become a separate thing that's kind of placed on the backs of teachers to do differently. I think about one of my favorite teachers growing up, Mrs. Wells, my language arts teacher. She was extraordinary. She made us feel seen. We had strong relationships with her. She brokered all kinds of conversations in the classroom. Like those are all SEL skills that she was doing, but we didn't know it. It was just organic in the language arts class. And that's really what we want teachers to be doing. So.
David, if I could just add, I asked Tim Shriver to send me into a DC school and give me a good example. I went to this school in the district. I was greeted together with all the other students by the superintendent who greeted every student by name. And when we did the work with Bob Alfans and I did the high school dropout work over the last 20 years, what we found when we surveyed the kids who had dropped out of high school was that they wanted to be named and claimed. They wanted to be understood who they were, what they wanted to be, what their dreams were, and connect learning to those dreams. But the second thing I witnessed, I walked into this third grade class to something called morning meeting. And the message I left was like, oh my God, believe in the kids, empower the kids. So there was this little third grade year old a girl with a little crown and a little wand who was leading the class in a discussion about how to improve the environment in their community. And she had to state the issue, have a discussion, open discussion. Nobody was criticized. No idea was dumb. And listen to one another. And then they had to come to a conclusion about what they would do together. It was mind-blowingly powerful, and it fostered empathy, listening, empowered the kids, and collaborating across difference to solve a problem. And I reported back to Tim. It was one of the most motivating. I learned those skills in law school. What's the issue? What are the relevant facts? What's the judgment? What are the implications for society? That framework, and here these kids were learning it in third grade through SEL. It was marvelous.
It's funny you say that, Bridge. I was doing some contract negotiations, surprisingly enough, and watching two lawyers interact. And I noted that they said things like, well, Bridge, that's a really good point. I'd like to respectfully refute that and add on that we're trying to do X, Y, and Z. And I turned to my chief of staff and I was like, because they want us to come to a consensus, their job is to bring the two sides together to sign this contract. And so what kind of skills do they employ to build that consensus? Well, of course, social and emotional learning skills. So I really resonate with what you were saying there, how lawyers use these skills because sometimes they're just in court arguing against each other, but sometimes their job is to bring us together. And I want to stay on that idea, and I'll give you guys about a minute each, and starting with Karen here. Karen, we have a theme this year, and it's about finding common ground and pursuing the common good. And I want to take about a minute for each person. What does that mean to you? Finding common ground, pursuing the common good in the context of SEL. Karen, Aaliyah, and then John.
For me, finding common ground first of all, it has to center on the students, on the young people. And for me, finding common ground is bringing every ounce of what we know about how learning happens, about the science of learning and development, and putting it into practice. And the Science Learning Development Alliance, called SELDay, has really sort of moved on to say, what are the conditions for optimal learning? And those conditions turn out to be 5. And I like to talk about them as the non-negotiables, because if any of these 5 things are in the red, optimal learning doesn't happen. First, it's relationships. Second, it's that sense of safety and belonging that each child has to have. Third, it's absolutely, positively rigorous, informative instruction, knowledge development. There's got to be a there that we want them to be doing. Fourth, we have to make sure that we're naming and talking about and building these skills and competencies. The attitudes, the mindsets that we're talking about have to be named and developed, not in a separate curriculum. This is a part of what optimal learning is. And then fourth, there have to be integrated supports. At a point at which there's something that's needed that's not in that classroom, not in that clubhouse, not in that library, not wherever the young people are, somebody has to know and know the kids well enough to say, let's get you more help. Whether that's more help because you need something advanced or more help because you need something more fundamental. So those would be what I would say. And the common good that comes from that is when we really do take the time to not just pick one of those, but recognize that they're all important, that different settings put up for different purposes start with different places, but none of them are doing their job if they aren't touching on all of those. None of them are doing their job if not touching on all of them. Whether it's a mentor program, it's a social services program, it's a, it's an academic program, they all have to be doing all 5 things.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for keeping that within that 1 minute time frame so that we can get to all of our panelists. Aaliyah, same question, finding common ground, pursuing the common good. What does it mean to you, SEL skills? And then Bridge will take us home.
Yeah, so for me, we've all had this shared experience. And for me, it has been really taking the time to understand what that experience has not only taught me, but has taught others, because we've all learned something from this. And how to use that to, as Pollyanna-ish as it may sound, but how do you use that to use the place and space in which I occupy to make the world a better place? Because fundamentally, the one thing we saw is how we are all universally connected. It may take time for it to reach my place in space, but ultimately we are all connected. And so how can I use the place and space that I occupy to make a change?
We are all connected. And let's bridge that connection to you, Bridge, so you can take us away. Finding common ground, pursuing common good, social emotional skills. What does that mean to you?
So I think we need schools of possibility and communities of possibility, and to rediscover a country of possibility. When I was a kid, I had the privilege of actually 3 doors down was a very reclusive man named Neil Armstrong, and he would come over for dinner. Never liked to talk about the moon. But one night when I was 18 years old, he was talking to my dad over dinner, and he said, when Kennedy issued that call to go to the moon and return them safely within a decade, technologically, we had no idea how to pull that off. But it mobilized 400,000 engineers around the world to make it happen. And I think what's missing today, we started this Office of American Possibilities, and it'll be launched in a couple of months, and we pulled together something called the COVID Collaborative, and Welcome.US to help the government resettle Afghan refugees and now the Ukrainians. And what I've discovered is people are coming out of the woodwork across administrations, politics, faith, background. And I think we need to create that sense of common purpose among our young people, and very early as preschool. And Martin Luther King was in kindergarten. You can be just like him. These people who did extraordinary things for our country, and just like you.
Possibilities. This is something that we are having the conversation about today. What does it mean to have a possibility of finding the common ground, pursuing the common good? What does it mean to use our social and emotional skills to come together? Bridge, thank you for your contribution to this conversation, your contribution to our country. Karen, thank you for your contribution to our community, contribution for what it means to be in community with each other. Aaliyah, thank you for your leadership on behalf of CASEL. Thank you for what you put out into the world. The social and emotional development of our young people is in your hands and in the hands of the audience here today on Social and Emotional Learning Day.